Hi, I'm Jane from Poppy Patchwork, and in today's video I'm going to show you how to make the Cloud 9 quilt. I'm going to show you how to add cornerstones, sashings and borders, and we're going to use the quilt blocks that we've made over the last 9 weeks. So to trim these down to the right size, I've got my blocks and I'm placing them on a rotating cutting mat, and I have a ruler here that is 9.5 square, so 9.5 inch square ruler, and I need to identify the halfway point. Now half of 9.5 is 4 3/4. If I take this block here and I'm going to line 4 3/4 on the ruler with the center point of my block, which is here, and then I've already done this block. I'm going to cut up one side, so I'm going to cut up here, then I'm going to rotate and rotate and rotate again. So that is now trimmed to 9.5 inches square. Now this one I've trimmed earlier, and you'll notice that there are points here, and we don't want to cut off our points, so we want to make sure there's at least 1/4 inch between the point and the edge of the fabric. Because very little is coming off when I'm doing that trimming, there's going to be enough of a seam allowance there for me when I come to sew them. So for this block, where there is no center seam, I do have these points here that I'm going to use to line up with the 4 3/4 inch on the ruler. So I've got 4 3/4 inches running along here, and now I just need to make sure that I've got 4 3/4 running along here. And now I can do the same. I can trim all around. And just checking every now and then to make sure everything's nicely lined up. So this block doesn't have anything really in the centre because it's got that narrow cross in the centre here. So I am going to press this in half in both directions so that I get little press lines. So what I'm going to do is going to match those seams up and then press like that, and then going to match them up in the opposite direction. So it's important to match the seams rather than the edges of the block, because they're the uneven parts. So now I can see the press points on the block, and I'm now able to line the 4 3/4 inches along this pressed area and the 4 3/4 along this pressed area, and I'm really quite happy with that now, so I'm going to trim. So I'm going to repeat that with the rest of the blocks, and then I'll come back to you to do the sashing. So I've got this green stripy fabric here for the sashings, and I've laid 2 blocks on top of it to just have a look to see how wide I want my sashings. I don't want them very wide at all, so this is currently 3/4 of an inch wide for the sashing. Now I bring it out to an inch, that's also not too bad at all. So I've drawn out the quilt with the sashings, the cornerstones and the borders to work out all the calculations for this. I've also worked out how I need to cut my long quarter. So I've got a 10-inch long quarter, and in the UK a long quarter is a quarter of a metre, which is 25 centimetres, and 25 centimetres is 10 inches. I know in the US you don't get quite as much in your long quarter. I think you get about 9 inches because a quarter of 36 inches is 9. So just mentioning that because I'm working on a long quarter that has 10 inches. For my diagram that I've drawn out, I need 7 strips. So if I do 10 divided by 7, I get 1.42 inches. So if I wanted to get 7 1.5 inches from my long quarter, I'd need my long quarter to be 10.5 inches. So I'm just going to measure it to see what I've actually got. I've actually got a long quarter that measures 11 inches. So I believe I can cut from this piece that's 11 inches by 42 inches, so 11 inches by the width of fabric. I believe I can cut 7 1.5 inch strips, which will give me a 1 inch sashing piece, which I can cut down if I think it's too wide. So I'm going to cut this into 7 strips of 1.5 inches. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to fold this in half again, and I'm going to straighten off one of the cut edges. So I'm lining my selvages together and I'm folding it in half. So then I'm going to line the markings of the ruler along this fold, and I'm going to cut as little as I can to straighten things up at this edge here. So now I've got a nice straight edge. I'm going to flip it over, and now I'm going to cut a 1.5 inch strip. And I'm going to get 7 of these. So there we go, I've got 7 strips out of that long quarter, and I was very lucky that the shop that sold it to me gave me 11 inches when normally I would only get 10. So according to my plan, I'm going to need 2 full length pieces for my side sashings, and I'm going to need 2 pieces for the top and bottom sashings that are not quite the full length, and then I'm going to need, from the remaining pieces, I need pieces that are 9.5 inches because that's the size of my block. Three of these strips need to be cut into 9.5 inches. So in total we're going to need 12 1.5 by 9.5 inch pieces. So I'm going to cut the selvages off. And then I'm going to cut 9.5 inches. That's 2. That's 4. That's 6. Eight. 10. And 12. So I've identified the blocks that are in the center of the quilt, and I'm going to place a sashing strip on opposite sides of these blocks. I'm just going to check that I've done the center one correct. This is bento, so I'm just going to check my photograph for that. And actually the photograph shows that I've done it incorrectly, because the green I have planned to be on the top left corner. So I'm just going to remove the sashing and pin it in the right place. So I'm going to take these over to the sewing machine now and sew with a 1/4 inch seam. So I'm going to set the seams and press them towards the sashing pieces. So I'm going to keep the sashing at 1 inch, so I'm not going to trim it. So I've identified the blocks that go above the ones that I've just sewn the sashing onto. So this one goes onto this one. And then we've got this one. And then we have this one here for the center of the quilt. So I'm going to go back over to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam. Once again, I'm going to set the seam and I'm going to press towards the sashing piece. So I've referred back to the layout diagram and I've got the correct blocks for each of these columns. So I'm going to take these back over to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam. So again, I'm going to set the seams and press towards the sashing strips. So from my cornerstone fabric, I'm going to cut 4 1.5 inch squares. Just going to straighten up what I've got. So I've got 5 here, and I think I might use these 4 as this one's a little bit less red. So now I need to take 2 sashing pieces and pin one of these squares onto each end. Now one of these wasn't quite 1.5 inches, so I'm going to identify which one that was and sew the narrower end first, so the difference will be lost in the seam allowance. So this is the one that is just slightly narrower, so I'm going to centre it in that area, and it's, as I say, it's very, very marginal, so any difference will be in the seam allowance. So I'm going to take those over to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam. So once again I'm going to set the seams, but this time I'm going to press towards the cornerstones. And now I'm going to pin a sashing piece on the other end of the cornerstone. So I'm going to take those back over to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam. So once again I'm going to set the seam and press towards the cornerstone. So taking the column of blocks where bento is in the middle, I'm going to pin this sashing strip onto each side of that block. And because we have pressed, oh, I pressed it the wrong way. I need to press them towards the sashing strips. I'm just going to do that and then I'll come back to you. I pressed the strips with the cornerstones and the seams have been pressed towards the sashing strips, and now I am going to attach these to each side of the strip with the centre blocks on it. So that's the one with bento in the middle. So I'm going to attach this sashing strip on both sides of this column of blocks. So I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam. So I'm going to set the seam and press it towards the sashing strips. So I'm now ready to put one of these columns onto the centre column, and I've checked the diagram and this is the right column to attach. So I'm going to pin this in place. And now I'm going to sew this together with a 1/4 inch seam. So I've sewn the 3 columns together and I'm now giving the quilt top a press. And I'm going to pin these onto the top and bottom of the quilt top. And I'm going to take these over to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam. And now I'm going to pin the sashing along the other edges. And I'm going to sew this in place with a 1/4 inch seam. So I've got 1/2 metre of fabric for my border, and I want my borders to be about 3 inches wide. So I'm going to cut this to 4 inches, just to give me a bit of wiggle room, and I can trim it down when I get to that point. So in the same way as I cut the pieces for the sashing, I'm going to cut the pieces for the border, and I'm going to cut mine at 4 inches wide. And I'm going to just need to cut 4 of these. Now I'm going to pin and sew these onto the quilt top like I did with the sashing pieces.